from the EWTN radio and television studios, this is EWTN Theology Roundtable, a conversation with the experts of EWTN's Department of Theology. Got questions about the liturgy, scripture, or tradition? They have the answers. Now, EWTN Theology Roundtable.
We are so glad that you're joining us here on EWTN Theology Roundtable, coming to you from Radio Studio 1 at our headquarters of EWTN in Birmingham, Alabama. Greetings to you. My name is Elena Rodriguez, and today on Theology Roundtable, we are going to be taking your questions on gender ideology. Gender ideology and our times. What is the attack of gender ideology on human nature and on our spiritual realm as well? The lines are open, 1-800-585-9396. That number again. You'll be able to talk to our call screener, Matt Gabinski, by calling 1-800-585-9396. Our expert today, as always on a Friday here on EWTN Radio, is Colin Donovan, who is the head of our theology department here at EWTN. Also joined by our expert panelists and theology advisors, Cindy Cuellar and David Gregson. So gender ideology, gender ideology has been called demonic, even by Pope Francis more than once. He has likened it to nuclear arms in its capacity to mass destruction, to destruct many lives. But exactly what are we talking about, Colin, when we use the term gender ideology?
Yeah, almost everybody in all ages of humanity, going back to the first human beings, understood that there is male and female. We see this in the natural world as well. There's a complementarity there. We know it's connected to life. It's propagation of the species, and it's a natural division. For believers, especially for Jews and Christians who hold the Bible dear as the Word of God, we understand that God is responsible for this natural order, that He ordained it in a particular way, and we give a supernatural meaning to it as well. But in gender ideology, it's basically a deconstruction of that. It says that, oh yes, although there are male and female, something that's very hard to deny for obvious reasons, that gender, however, is not binary, male and female, but it's pluriform, and it takes the form of the inclination of the person, the psychosexual attractions, interests of the person. And therefore, what gender ideology tends to do is to label all things which in the past would have been connected with male and female roles, behavior, responsibilities, and so on, is merely a social construction, which different times can call for different approaches. And so what it does is it attacks not just the roles of man and woman in society, but the role of man and woman in family, in the political life of a society, man and woman in culture, and that's an attack on nature itself, and not just on Christian or Jewish or Islamic or other belief or philosophy that surrounds man and woman. So it's a very, very destructive thing. And I think, of course, we've been building up slowly, at least in our country, in our political and social life on this, various attacks made to gain special privileges and rights for the LGBT community. And then I think with the SCOTUS decision, the Supreme Court of the United States deciding last year that same-sex sexual unions are civilly equivalent to heterosexual unions, or what we call marriage, and that will be the law of the land. We've seen the floodgates open, and most recently we've seen lawsuits related to trying to open the door to transgendered individuals. Transgender is a very broad category that includes people who simply have an inclination. They can even be gender fluid. They could feel like a girl or woman one day and like a man the next day. And so the argument is, well, they should be able to use the bathroom facilities, whether male or female, to whatever that feeling, that inclination. And so this has brought up, Cindy especially, you've looked at this question of the civil aspects of this, the legal aspects, which are certainly based on this gender ideology.
Yes. Actually, this past May 12th, the Obama administration issued a directive on transgender bathroom access, whereby public schools are to permit students to use bathrooms and locker rooms based on their gender identity, not their biological sex. And schools are obligated to treat transgender students in a way that matches their gender identity, even if their education records or identity documents indicate a different sex. Now, the directive also applies to sports teams and the use of pronouns when addressing a student who no longer identifies with his or her biological sex. Now, this directive comes days after the Justice Department and North Carolina filed dueling lawsuits over a new state law, commonly known as House Bill 2 or HB 2, which legislates that individuals in government buildings are to use restrooms and changing facilities that correspond to the sex on their birth certificates.
Yeah, and let's pause 1 second for that, because as you described it, it's clear we're not talking about individuals who have a sexual development issue or a disorder of sexual development.
That's right.
Who may legally go to a judge and say, I was mistakenly raised as a boy, even though my identity and my confused, sometimes been called intersex physical condition, I feel like a boy. You can legally change your birth certificate and then would qualify to use the bathroom of that particular sex. We're not talking about these cases. We're talking about a feeling which is very fluid, as the gender fluidity has been said to be.
Yeah, an example is Evergreen College in Olympia, Washington. Evergreen College decided to allow a 45-year-old transgender student who identifies as a woman but has male genitalia to use the college's women's locker room, shared with a Capitol High School swim club and a children's swim academy, some of whose children are as young as 6 years old. A mother reported that her daughter was upset because she observed a man in the women's locker room naked and displaying himself. A college spokesman defended the situation, saying that gender identity is one of the protected things in discrimination law in this state. So a transgender individual, even though he may be transgendered only for one day, is protected at the expense of young children.
Who are boys or girls, as the case may be.
Yeah.
Now, a few years ago in Washington State, interestingly, there was a situation in Catholic high schools regarding a homosexual teacher who came out. We're now seeing these cases also in Catholic schools of transsexual teachers who come out of the closet, as it were.
Yes, the administration of Mercy High School in San Francisco announced that a Jewish woman who teaches English at the school would now be accepted as a man and can keep her job. Now get this, the school offered counselors to help the students of the all-girls school accept the biologically female teacher's new gender identity as a man. And in a letter to parents, the school explained, "We strive to witness to mercy when we honor the dignity of each person in a welcoming culture that pursues integrity of word and deed. But what is overlooked in all of this are Holy See norms addressing this and other hiring situations. For instance, there's Canon Law 803, which states teachers are to be outstanding in correct doctrine and integrity of life. And there's the U.S. National Directory for Catechesis, which states administrators should recruit teachers who are practicing Catholics, who can understand and accept the teachings of the Catholic Church and the moral demands of the gospel, and who can contribute to the achievement of the school's Catholic identity and apostolic goals. And as noted earlier, Pope Francis calls gender theory or gender ideology a mistake of the human mind in not recognizing the order of creation. With this attitude, man commits a new sin, that against God, the Creator.
So we have the sad situation of a modern Catholic school institution adopting essentially a dualist position, separating mind and body as if we can
They're
do
separable,
that.
yeah.
Something that was condemned as a heresy in the early church. But now we also have right-thinking secular people who've even changed their minds and have decided that this stuff is completely idiotic, total nonsense.
Yes, the ACLU director in Georgia quit the ACLU after her daughters encountered 3 men in their restroom. A mother, I quote, 3 transgender young adults over 6 feet tall with deep voices entered. My children were visibly frightened, concerned about their safety, and left asking lots of questions for which I, like many parents, was ill-prepared to answer. The mother also stated that the ACLU has become a special interest organization that promotes not all but certain progressive rights. The hierarchy of rights the ACLU chooses to defend or ignore, she wrote, is based on who is funding the organization's lobbying activities. So you pay and you're protected.
I think that's the history of the world, isn't it? Money and power is what gets people to do what you want. And so we're facing that very much today, I think, Elena, and it's a situation we have to come to grips with.
And we'll continue to talk about gender ideology. How is it affecting you? Do you feel gender ideology is being pushed down your throat? Share with us, 1-800-585-9396. That number again is 1-800-585-9396. Still time to get into the show here with EWTN Theology Roundtable with Colin Donovan, David Gregson, and Cindy Cuellar. Stay tuned.
Welcome back to EWTN Theology Roundtable on EWTN Radio and Television.
That's right. We are checking our email here as we are doing this show live on EWTN Radio on gender ideology and how it is affecting you. We're receiving your calls, and we have only one line open at this point, and that line is 1-800. Actually, it's 1-205-271-2985. That would be a good time for you to call in and still get in the show and this discussion with Colin Donovan, David Gregson, and Cindy Cuellar. We go to Adam, who's listening in Michigan to EWTN Radio through the Ave Maria Radio Network. Adam, what is your question for our panelists today? Welcome.
Well, thank you, and I want to thank you for taking on such a kind of a strange subject. But my question is, I've heard, and I can't remember the source, but that some of the behavior medication that we're passing out to the children, it could be part of a side effect, these feelings, and I've heard even physical effects of this gender confusion.
Yeah, I've not heard that, but I don't doubt it. I mean, there's been a lot of discussion for the last 30 or 40 years of what is the effect of even small amounts of estradiol from the estrogen-like compounds going into the water supply. And scientists have noticed the feminization of amphibians and so on as a consequence. And we sort of dismiss the possibility of changing our very responses at that level in us, maybe because we're a more complex thing than a frog or a salamander. But I think this is a valid area of science to look into, because with so many chemicals in circulation, so much now we have genetic modified foods and other things, we don't really yet know. We're so new to this technology, we don't yet know what the long-term influence would be.
Yeah, I've heard that human fertility has diminished over the past number of years, and I'm not sure if this is connected, but I suspect that there might be some connection.
There might be some suppression of the person's hormonal responses to external influences, like a person of the opposite sex. Because I've also read that too, that especially in males they find that the population is diminished, that is able to bring about a new life.
Right.
And it is definitely an element of fertility that
The count is down.
the count is down. Exactly.
Very good. Thank you, Adam, for that question. We go to Grand Rapids, Michigan, where Jim is listening to EWTN radio through Holy Family Radio. Jim, your question, please. Go ahead.
My question is, why do we acquiesce to the word gender? God gave us a sex. We are either male or female. Gender is man-made, a literary term, and people can apply it wherever they want, but that's people. I answer to God, and God gave me a sex male and my daughter a sex female. Why do we let the society take it over and say gender? There's no such thing as a gender male, gender female. That makes no sense to me.
No, and it doesn't. But the trouble is, you're dealing with people who believe that it does, and you have to show that it is binary, and the binary is male and female. You argue that from nature. You argue it from Revelation as well. It's just part of having to speak to explain that to people. You have to use those terms. No, there are no other genders than the two, male and female.
There's no neuter gender.
There is no, as there is in Latin and other grammars. There's no neuter gender. There is feminine, masculine, and neuter in languages, but there is not in life. And you make a good point, and it's clear that once you've crossed that line and accepted the factuality of this variety of gender, even simply a third one, which is not connected to the human nature in a way. And by that, what would be the purpose? That we know what male and female is about. It has a natural purpose, just as eating has a purpose. And the organs of eating and digestion and urination and defecation serve purposes in nature. Well, the sexual organs serve purpose in nature, and that purpose is connection to the purposes of the complementary physical and psychic structure of male and female. But when you start talking about 56 others, or why not 96? Why not 506? Then how do you connect that up with nature? It's entirely subjective, and that is somewhat this nuclear effect that the Pope has talked about.
That's right. That's right. It's causing chaos.
I suspect that the goal is to have no distinctions at all, just totally fluid, just degrees of one thing or another, and no longer pay any attention to what someone's orientation may be.
Yeah, there's been a number of articles saying that this is one of the fruits of feminism, that in order to destroy the gender role of women at all levels, especially, of course, motherhood and that which flows from femininity, that it's necessary to have these. This is sort of the end stage of feminism, and that is you cannot ultimately have anything other than sort of a functional male and female role. In other words, yes, males and females produce children. Other than that, it's fluid.
Thanks, Jim, for that very important question. We move to the state of Michigan, going back to Michigan, and Katie is driving through the state of Michigan, hopefully very safely, listening through Holy Family Radio. Katie, your question, please. Go ahead.
We've been dealing with this for several years now with my husband, and he's very much an advocate of the transgender and claims that he's actually female, and he had facial reconstruction surgery. He hasn't done anything else. We're still married. We've been married for 35 years. We have grown children and some grandchildren, but it's been very painful. And we're still married, but it's a very different marriage. And I every day I'm praying, trying to figure out how to handle this and trying to do it in the most godly way that I can. And we're very, very opposed in what this is. And I guess I'm not really sure what I'm supposed to be doing.
Sure. Well, upholding the church's teaching, which allows bodily reconstruction to solve genetic disorders that produce sexual organs that are not male or female or intermediate or other, the so-called disorders of disorders of sexual development. But to remove something that's functioning and working is to mutilate yourself, and the church forbids this. Our bodies are a gift from God. Masculinity and femininity are a gift from God to be honored.
That's right. That's right. I was going to mention, you were talking about your husband. I read an article just recently of a man who said he was a transgender and went ahead and had his, I call it sex change, others call it sex reassignment, and he regrets everything that he did. And he says, what's amazing about all of this is that transgender individuals are never required to undergo any objective tests to prove their gender dysphoria, because there are no diagnostic objective tests that are in existence.
Just to say that it's in their minds.
It's just in their minds.
So I don't know if he's getting counseling. If he is, it ought to be Christian counseling or Catholic counseling, whatever. Whoever will respect the natural order and the moral obligations that we have to the created order. That would be one thing. Obviously, prayer on the part of his family, and helping him to try to see that, see the light. That this if the body says the opposite of what your mind is telling you, then you need to find the truth. Is the body right? Is the mind right? And the mind is easier to change. It's a spiritual thing. People have great conversions from one inch to another, where they change their moral behavior and their thinking processes completely because of Christ, because of grace. The mind is easy to change. The body, not so easy, because all you can do is, like the Pope says, nuclear war on it. These kinds of surgeries are lifelong mutilations, because that which the surgeon does must be sustained chemically to keep the person in a state which is opposite what their genetics is telling them it should be. It is a lifelong chemical mutilation as well as a physical mutilation. I think medically and ethically that is something that doctors should think about. What are really the ethics of doing this?
What are the ethics, and what else can we throw into this conversation, such as what are the long-term effects of our failure to act today? Better understanding gender ideology. That's our show today here on EWTN Theology Roundtable with our experts Colin Donovan, Cindy Cuellar, and David Gregson. You can join the conversation 205-271-2985. We continue in a moment.
Welcome back to EWTN Theology Roundtable on EWTN Radio and Television.
Elena Rodriguez here with our experts today discussing gender ideology, Colin Donovan, David Gregson, and Cindy Cuellar. We have Jonathan driving through Oklahoma listening to EWTN radio through Oklahoma Catholic Broadcasting. Jonathan, what is your question? Go ahead.
Hi, how you doing? Thanks for taking my call. My question has to do with, first off, exceptions to the natural law and just anomalies. So first off, I mean, I've met several males that have feminine attributes and females that have masculine attributes. And then in the extreme case, there's, I guess they're called hermaphrodites or something like that. Someone who's born with both sex organs, and it's up to the parent to make the decision at birth, if they make a decision at all, what sex they'll be. When we're trying to appeal to someone to recognize this division between male and female and the complementarity of the sexes and the natural law and the purpose-driven end of the natural law towards procreation and whatnot, these seem to be, well, they're true. I sure recognize it. But when we're talking about these are values, right? What else can we appeal to aside from the natural law? Because I feel that these exceptions, these small exceptions to the norm of the natural law, can cause a lot of problems in some sort of debate or argument. So, what other cards can we play aside from the natural law?
Well, I think you're misidentifying what the natural law is, for starters. If what you took, and this is also a position taken by the other side of the question, if it's found in nature, it is natural. That's not what natural law means. If that's true, then the behavior of human beings in warfare that is not honorable, in rape, in family abuse in the families, and so on, all of these things are simply, well, they're natural because they're, and we don't accept that. We accept that there are ways in which that which nature has given us ought to be used. Now, philosophers call that teleology. It has an end, a purpose. Whatever we want to call it that gets the message across, we're talking about something that on a philosophical level that we can identify the purpose, what human nature, the purposes of, say, the parts of human nature, as I did earlier, digestion. Very intentionally, we can say that digestion and nutrition and all has a purpose to keep the species alive. And philosophers have identified sexuality as the purpose of keeping the species alive. It propagates the species, the continuation of the species. So it doesn't mean it's the only end of sexuality, but sexuality, to be properly used, should at least have that in view, or at least not oppose it. And this is actually the theological position of the church, and even natural philosophers come to that conclusion. And I think biology would actually support it as well. That if you're looking at the system of the reproductive systems, they are there for a particular purpose. Therefore, things that are contrary to that purpose can't be without some kind of difficulty for the individual. Just as cancer creates a difficulty in the body because the natural systems do not work as possible, we are unique in creation that we can create the difficulties in our own bodies because of our spiritual will. And we can create the difficulties in us by our decisions. And so when you go against the nature of the thing and its purpose, there's going to be consequences. You wouldn't pour gasoline down your throat and consider that to be hydration. Well, you wouldn't play in a sewer and think that that's a good place to go swimming, that it's a healthy place, that it serves the purpose of recreation, and so on and so forth. And you go down the line and you have ways of seeing that complementarity of the sexes in the sexual realm is every bit as vital, in fact more vital to the continuation of the species than or at least as vital as eating is to the continuation of the individual. So this is the logic, and from that you can draw all kinds of rational conclusions. Maybe not as securely as that one single conclusion about the nature of complementarity, but other conclusions you can draw that mental decisions, decisions that are ideas about how one ought to live that's contrary to human nature, are not in our own best interests. And in fact, Cindy, this is exactly what psychologists and others, going back to the studies done at Johns Hopkins when they were the first medical center in the country to do transsexual surgeries, and then they did a psychiatric study, and they found all the medical evidence they needed to say, we can't participate in these changes because they do not help the individual.
Right. And there are several other studies that have been conducted that I'd like to talk about. I mentioned this gentleman, Walt Heyer, who had a sex change and now regrets it. He's been following this very closely and talks about recent studies. For instance, there were research studies done in 2013 and 2009 that were looking for a transgender gene. And what they found, that there was not a smidgen of abnormality in the genetic makeup that causes someone to be transgender. And when we're talking about childhood gender dysphoria, there was a 2015 study that was aimed to gather input from pediatric endocrinologists, from psychologists, from psychiatrists and ethicists, both that were in favor and those that were opposed. And the results showed that there was no consensus on these basic topics, and they recommend suppressing puberty with drugs until age 16, after which cross-sex hormones may be given. And so there really isn't a consensus. They really don't have any certitude. And he's saying, guys, it's to stop using children as experiments, because this is causing grave harm to them. And what he says is they need psychotherapy, not access to cross-sex restrooms and showers and dressing rooms. To blame society for the ills of the transgender persons is not going to improve the diagnosis. That's not what we need. And he says reckless disregard for the mental disorders in favor of enforcing preferred pronouns is madness. It's time to show compassion by telling the truth and stop pretending that they're born that way, because they're not.
Rather than promoting a social agenda at the expense of the health of the people that they're dealing with.
And it really is a social agenda, because consider the dichotomy between the way society is expected to treat people who make a behavior choice not founded in their biology,
Mm-hmm.
and those, for instance, who wish to make a religious opinion, something which for millennia philosophers and intellectuals have understood, that the spiritual impulse, whatever form it takes, is intrinsic to man.
Mm-hmm.
Religion follows man wherever he goes, even if it's erroneous, creation of myths and so on. There's something in us that goes beyond ourselves and even our species that's transcendent, and we have that striving in us. But yet we wish to suppress religious instinct in this country in order to accept something which is not at all founded in human nature in any way, shape, or form.
Thank you, Jonathan, very much. We go to Margaret, who's listening in the state of Michigan. We're getting a lot of calls today from the state of Michigan, and she's listening to EWTN radio through the Ave Maria Radio Network. Margaret, your question, please. Go right ahead.
Yes, thank you, and thank you so much for taking my call. It's
Sure.
so nice to call in with this wonderful expertise on the panel today. But this is an issue that I've never been conflicted over. I've always followed the teachings of the Catholic Church. Our family is a devout Catholic family until my godson was born. And one of my dearest friends, she has boys and girls. Her son was born. I happened to be his godmother.
Mm-hmm.
And from the time that child could stand up and put his hand on a toy, he just assimilates while he's a boy, he assimilates and everything he does, says, wants, everything is centered on being a girl. And, and these aren't rational choices that he makes. He's so young.
How old is he now?
So now he's 9 years old.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't matter when he comes to my house, wherever he goes, you could get him playing soccer for 15 minutes and you turn your head and he's, downstairs looking for the dress-up
Sure.
clothes.
Yeah.
Well, it's nothing that he's rationally thinking through and doing. And I think it's a very, it's an easy question when you say there's a 6-foot man in the bathroom. Yeah, that's disturbing and that would be upsetting. But when you see this little boy, and I've been around him his whole life, his desire, everything he dreams about and talks about is becoming a girl. Now, his parents are very devout Catholic parents. They have no interest, no discussion in any type of reassignment or hormone or anything, and they do have him in counseling. But this is the first time I've seen it up close, and I can just see the suffering, this child has now, obviously in school. The boys don't want to play with him because they say you're a girl, and the girls don't want to play with him because he's a boy. And it's just heart-wrenching to see kind of the suffering and sorrow that he has in front of them. And our hope, of course, as godparents, is that he never loses his faith.
Yeah. Well, and you don't want to diagnose a 9-year-old on the air, of course. So, and we're not going to do that. But I will say there can be all kinds of causation, hormonal causation. We had the question earlier about the ADHD drugs, whether perhaps there's some connection there. We don't know if he used those. Don't know what other influences, environmental influences. They're now finding in a new science of epigenetics that there are hormonal influences in the womb that can pass on a generation or two. They're not strictly genetic. They're called epigenetics. They're a phenomena of the histones, the coating around the DNA, and how things that usually are affecting the parents or the mother and the child in the womb can be passed on and for a generation or two and change our responses to things, not just in the sexual area, but other areas. There are a lot of influences here, but none of those environmental, cultural, social influences that impact it justify departing from both the natural law and the divine moral law in these questions. Like everything else in life that is the fruit of our fallen human nature, a nature possible of sin, possible of objective sin because without our choice, or subjective sin because we've chosen to do it. We can't know what influences are happening on your godson and what has caused this. And then you throw in the cultural influences and the influences in the school, where there is a great push to teach this spectrum of genders as a biological fact. It is a biological fact that between a fully functioning masculinity on one end of the biochemical scale and femininity on the, that yes, there's quite a few variable conditions, but are we going to end up with 7 billion genders for the 7 billion variable human beings on the planet? We can't do that. Nature tells us what they are. So this is an area that can be investigated in an individual, but if it's not founded on biological fact, if it's not founded on an intersex condition where nature has gone awry in that way, then we have to look at the psychological and the psychiatric. Because as I mentioned earlier, those are the things that are more pliable. You think the body is pliable because you can cut an organ off or graft one out of another part of the body and make somebody, no. It's in the DNA. It's at the genetic level. And that can never be changed. And this is why sexual reassignment surgery never achieves its purpose. The person needs to come to grips at whatever age they are with the gift of the body as they have it.
I would suggest that the boy not be compelled to do boy things if he doesn't feel so inclined. Allow him to do what might be thought of as girly things, just short of presenting himself as a girl. Bring him to a realization, if you can, that he is a boy. He may have different tastes from many of his friends, but nonetheless he is a boy, and he should be honest with himself, enjoy what he enjoys, but not pretend he's a girl.
And there is always the possibility, given that he said from his first conscious thinking, that there is some genetic condition driving this. And if that has not been investigated, that is an avenue to look at. Because among the disorders of sexual development, there are those that are discovered only in adulthood, but they are every bit as real as the ones discovered at birth when a little boy has girl organs or a little girl has boy organs. And that is possible avenue of pursuit for parents who are wondering about their child. But if those does not exist, then the obligation is to help them psychologically, psychiatrically, to live in the real world and come to grips with the gift of their sexuality as it is.
Thank you, Margaret. And now we go to Pam, who is driving through the beautiful state of Ohio. Pam, what is your question for Colin Donovan, Cindy Cuellar, and David Gregson? Go ahead, please.
Hello. Thank you for
Hello.
taking my call. I so deeply feel God's love in my heart, and as I'm listening to your station, I'm thinking about all the need for Christian love in the world with people who are hungry and homeless, and I wonder why you choose to focus on hating rather than love, judging people on how they choose to love one another when there's so much need for Christians to focus on healing the world and not micromanaging people's lives. And it does not say in the Bible anywhere where you shouldn't, anything about gender.
No, it says, and God made them male and female. In his own image, he created them. And so the Bible absolutely does teach that male and female together, in other words, in marriage, is an image of God himself. And Pope John Paul II explained this very minutely in his catechesis on Genesis and other texts on marriage and family life in the late 70s and 80s, when he showed that the Trinitarian communion of persons is reflected in the marital bond, the love, and the holding together of male and female in complementarity. That a difference of persons does not mean a difference of nature. It doesn't mean that you can't have a perfect unity. And so this is the point the Pope is trying to make. There's another quote which will shock you even more if you think that telling people the truth is
hate.
Is hate. Here is the quote, and I'm going to quote from the visionary of Fatima, Sister Lucia, who passed away in 2005. She wrote a letter to the man the Pope John Paul II appointed the head of his Institute of Marriage and Family in Rome. He had written her and asked for prayers, and she responded to him, a very famous person she was, Sister Lucia Fatima, and she responded to Monsignor Cafara, "The final battle between the Lord and the reign of Satan will be about marriage and the family. Don't be afraid, because anyone who works for the sanctity of marriage and the family will always be fought and opposed in every way, because this is the decisive issue. However, Our Lady has already crushed its head." And that's why the Pope calls it demonic. It's a fight over human nature. We believe that we have made ourselves. God, we did not make ourselves. God made us. And even if you believe evolution made you, this stuff is an absolute nonsense. And yet, I'm going to be prescribed, and all of us here and the whole country proscribed from saying anything that is truthful about this, or opposing the use of bathrooms by people who should not be in those bathrooms, because it will hurt their feelings. When they feel no compunction about teaching hate for religious values in the school districts through their anti-bullying programs. The lead anti-bullyist, who is a known atheist and hater of the Catholic Church, Mike Weinstein, I think his name is. So this is not about hate. This is about telling people the truth. It'll be the other way around. They will no doubt hate us, and they do, and because we must be removed that this ideology survive.
Is it hatred if you try to prevent a friend from drinking poison? I mean, it may hurt his feelings. He may have a taste for it, but it's not hatred to try to prevent him from hurting himself.
It would be hatred to not try to prevent him. Say, this is none of my business. Go ahead, Joe, drink that poison.
Yeah, be tolerant.
It'd be tolerant, though. It'd be very tolerant.
And I also want to note that Cardinal Surratt at the National Catholic Prayer Breakfast said, he was very adamant about this, and he said, today we find ourselves before a battle of a sickness that has pervaded our world. I repeat, a battle of a sickness that we're facing. He says, I call this sickness the liquidation, the eclipse of God. Man saying that he's not what God created him to be. No, God has created you male. God has created me female. And it's not based on what I think I am.
Right. I think it's incumbent today, in 2016, as it will be in 2017 and beyond, for all believers who say they believe in God to stand up for God's creative act in creating man and woman, for God's redeeming act in restoring man and woman to the creation as he intended them to be, and for the work of the Holy Spirit in both of those divine acts, creating and redeeming. And if not, then you are a practical atheist. If you won't stand up for what God created, you are living as if there is no God and demanding that I be God, and all of these things are simply realities that I choose and impose upon myself. And you can do that, but just like the law of gravity will have its way, human nature will have its way. It can't be changed by our thinking it.
Thanks, Pam. And we go to Sarah, who is in St. Louis, Missouri, listening to EWTN Radio through the Covenant Radio Network. Sarah, your question, please. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, thanks for taking my call.
Sure.
Do you hear me?
Perfectly.
We do.
Okay. I wanted to comment on the lady who I believe she was driving in Michigan, if I remember correctly, who said that her husband had something done to his face, if I remember correctly, and just wanting to give her some support and growing, helping him work through that. One of the big things I think that she could do, because I didn't hear you guys give her some practical advice in that regard. Not saying it's what you guys said, but is that going to adoration and praying a ton for him. My dad had gone through something challenging, not the same thing, but and my mom and dad stopped praying together, and she just started to go to adoration, and it totally transformed their marriage. Another thing that I would strongly recommend is that her to dive in more into her femininity. I'm an absolute lover of JP2's Theology of the Body and Love Responsibility and studied them thoroughly. And one of the things, I'm getting married soon, and one of the things in prepping for that is I was learning about how to be more of a supportive woman and spouse. And one book that Father Morrow in Christian Courtship and Oversexed World recommended was The Fascinating Girl and The Fascinating Woman, and I've learned it to be extremely valuable resource in teaching me how men's brains work compared to women. And I think that's one of the crutches of the problem, is that a lot of times we're not taught as children this beautiful difference between our femininity and masculinity. And not to say that certain people have, certain men have strengths that are could you could categorize as more of
Yeah, those are all good suggestions, and I think the prayer especially. If the message of Fatima is at least some way connected with our times, then also the Rosary is also the nuclear response to this nuclear attack, and we should use the Rosary.
Exactly. Prayer. Thank you very much, Colin Donovan, Cindy Cuellar, and David Gregson for enlightening us throughout this hour on the topic of gender ideology here on EWTN Theology Roundtable. This show will also be posted on our YouTube channel, so if you missed any part of it, you can always go back to YouTube and look for EWTN Theology Roundtable. EWTN continues with more Catholic Solid programming. Stay tuned.